Donald Trump continues to insist that if he loses this election, it will be because it was rigged against him. And this is a message that resonates with a lot of Trump voters as well as Bernie Sanders voters, because we saw how the primary was in fact rigged against Bernie Sanders, who was Hillary Clinton's opponent then. So just logically, if it was rigged then, why wouldn't it be rigged now? And I wanted to take the time to really clarify what Donald Trump is saying, because I think his remarks overall are actually really troubling. So look, let's go back and revisit the primary. We saw how the DNC colluded with Clinton's campaign in order to sabotage Bernie Sanders. They tried to limit debates. They restricted his access to van. It was a big debacle. The media didn't cover it, but we know, as revealed in the WikiLeaks release of DNC's emails, that they actively tried to destroy his campaign. Also, the media was against Bernie Sanders, just like the media now is against Donald Trump. So there's some validity to the claim that the odds are kind of stacked against Donald Trump. But by saying that the election is rigged, this is problematic, and you have to be really careful, because you're going to walk into a Republican trap if you do buy into what he's saying.
Why would you think that the election would be rigged?
Well, I'm looking at all of these decisions coming on down from the standpoint of identification, voter ID, and I'm saying, what do you mean? You don't have to have voter ID to now go in and vote? And it's a little bit scary, and I've heard a lot of bad things. I must say, 4 years ago, I was hearing a lot of bad things having to do with the Romney campaign, where, when the vote came out, there were some districts that were really shockingly different from what they were anticipated to be. And I've been seeing it, and I've been hearing it a lot. But the whole thing with voter ID, identification, I think is really, people are going to walk in, they're going to vote 10 times maybe. Who knows? They're going to vote 10 times.
Now, it was the case that during the primary, there was multiple instances of election fraud. So we saw exit polls were off in multiple states, past the margin of error. Voters were purged from the rolls in cities and precincts where Bernie Sanders had demographic advantages. We also saw voter suppression tactics. And all of these things are evidence of election fraud. But what happened during the primaries against Bernie Sanders is very different from what Donald Trump is claiming will happen at this election. So to a lot of Bernie supporters, they'll hear that and say, well, the primary was effectively rigged against Bernie, so why wouldn't Hillary rig it again against Donald Trump? But look, we have to acknowledge that voter fraud and election fraud are two very different things. Donald Trump is claiming that voter fraud will occur, but during the primary, election fraud occurred. Now, this is not just the semantical difference. This comes down to culpability. So when voter fraud occurs, that's carried out by individuals. When election fraud occurs, that's carried out by parties and officials. Now, voter fraud itself is very rare, whereas when it comes to election fraud, you can find evidence of it in several precincts in every single election. For example, in one crucial Floridian precinct in 2000, Al Gore had negative votes, meaning that he had, for example, 1,500 negative votes, and once he earned 1,500 votes, then he'd start at 0 against Bush, and then anything he earns after that would go towards his tally. Now, this is a flaw or scam or whatever you want to call it that's evident in the Diebold machines used to count the votes. That's what election fraud is. But Donald Trump is claiming something very different. If you buy into Donald Trump's claim that voter fraud is being committed, you're walking right into a common Republican trap, because they claim that you need an ID to vote because voter fraud is so prevalent. But that's bullshit. Yes, it happens, but it's very rare. In fact, it's likely statistically insignificant, and Republicans claim that voter fraud is an issue just so that way they can enforce these voter ID laws, which are specifically designed to disenfranchise poor voters, typically African Americans and Latinos. And what does this do? Why do Republicans care about this? This helps them win, because when poor people and black people and Latinos stay home, guess who has electoral victories? The Republicans. So that's why they try to push this false claim that voter fraud is a huge widespread issue, when in actuality that's not the case. Now, Republicans do this about multiple things. They talk about Social Security and how it's going bankrupt. So they try to create a problem, and then they want to propose a solution to it, and the media buys into it, and they end up winning based on that. It's very strategic, and it works. It's very effective, and Democrats walk into that trap too. But I'm warning everyone, don't walk into Donald Trump's trap. Voter fraud is so rare. You can maybe find 1 or 2 examples per election where one person votes 10 times. It's not enough to change the results of the election. Unlike election fraud, which actually does change the results of the election sometimes. We all know that George Bush in 2000 committed election fraud, or at least he benefited suspiciously enough from election fraud, and that cost Al Gore the election. We all know that Hillary Clinton suspiciously benefited from election fraud against Bernie Sanders, and that cost him the election. One report estimates that he lost 184 pledged delegates due to election fraud. So this isn't something that just Democrats do. Republicans and Democrats both commit election fraud, and they do it in different precincts in different states. So when Donald Trump claims that the election will be rigged due to voter fraud, it's bullshit. He has no evidence for this. He's pulling it out of his ass because he doesn't want to look bad when he inevitably loses. Now, if he's going to claim that election fraud will be an issue, then you can't even know about that until after the election occurs or right before it. So the main takeaway is that we have to be very careful when talking about election fraud and voter fraud because they're two very different things. Voter fraud is very, very rare. It almost never happens. Election fraud is very, very frequent, and both parties commit it very often. So don't let Donald Trump try to persuade you that he's disadvantaged in this way when it comes to voter fraud. There's no evidence of voter fraud, and most likely that's not going to be what loses him the election. It's going to be his own big mouth. So, be very wary when people are trying to cry fraud.